The fluorescent lights of the First National Bank branch in downtown San Francisco hummed with a sterile indifference that did little to mask the sudden drop in temperature inside the room. Across the mahogany desk, the branch manager, a man whose neat gray part usually projected calm authority, kept blinking rapidly, as though trying to clear a smudge from his glasses. He slid a single sheet of heavy cream paper across the wood toward me, his finger tapping twice on the signature line at the very bottom. The ink was a neat, practiced loop that spelled out my name, Emma Johnson, but the angle of the crossbar on the capital E belonged to a hand that had never held a pen the way I did. My parents had walked in 48 hours earlier, while I was locked behind glass in a medical compliance audit room across the bay, presented a forged power of attorney, and initiated a wire transfer pulling $3,200,000 out of my personal trust fund and into a freshly minted corporate shell entity named Johnson Family Holdings, LLC. The manager looked up, his voice dropping into that careful, rehearsed register people use when they are terrified of a lawsuit they didn't see coming. Your father said you were traveling abroad for an extended period and had authorized them to consolidate the accounts for tax efficiency. He even provided a copy of your passport page, though he mentioned you were in a rush and couldn't make it in person. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam my hand against the desk or demand they call the police right that second, because a compliance auditor learns very early that panic is just a donation of your leverage to the other side. Instead, I leaned back against the padded chair, let my eyes trace the neat rows of routing numbers, and thought about the spare house key my mother had asked for under the Prius of watering my fiddle leaf fig while I worked late shifts. Before I go on and show you how that single piece of paper became the pivot point for everything they thought they had stolen, please take a moment to hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and how old you were when you realized the people who raised you viewed you as an investment portfolio rather than a daughter. I read every single word, and welcome back to Anna Tells Stories, where we untangle the complicated knots our families tie behind our backs and answer them with quiet, unshakable facts. My name is Emma Johnson. I am 32 years old, and for a living I read thousands of pages of corporate contracts line by line, hunting for the hidden clauses where people try to hide what they shouldn't be touching. Now let me take you back to how I got to that desk, starting with the quiet afternoon 3 months prior, when my grandmother Evelyn pressed a heavy iron key into my palm in the middle of a California drizzle and told me that the people who share your blood are sometimes the only ones you ever truly need a contract against. Evelyn had lived 84 years in a house overlooking the gray Pacific in Monterey, and she had spent 40 of those years watching my father Thomas manage to turn every small business venture into a financial crater, while my mother Linda stood by offering polite, hollow justifications that smoothed over every disaster. While my younger sister Jessica grew up accustomed to brand new sedans appearing in the driveway on cue because my parents believed appearance was the only currency that mattered, my tuition checks were something I cleared myself through night shifts at a local clinic and public library clerk wages. Nobody drove me to my first apartment in San Francisco. Nobody helped carry the boxes up 3 flights of narrow stairs when I landed my first junior compliance role at the health authority. I did not resent them for the silence, because silence is something you can build a sturdy life around if you learn how to furnish it properly. But the day Evelyn died in her sleep, without a single relative at her bedside, except for me, because the rest of them were 3 counties away attending a charity gala for Jessica's failing boutique wellness enterprise. The quiet stopped being neutral. It became a warning. At the reception afterward, while the extended cousins murmured polite condolences over lukewarm chicken salad, my father cornered me near the coat rack with a tight practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, asking for my social security number and a certified copy of my birth certificate, under the guise of settling final estate taxes that didn't actually exist. I told him no, simply and clearly, and watched the amiable mask slip for a fraction of a second, revealing the narrow, desperate calculation underneath. That was the first small tremor, the pebble rolling down the ridge before the entire mountain let go, and it led directly to the Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed at my desk with an automated fraud alert from the bank asking me to confirm an outgoing wire transfer for an amount that would have bought a medium-sized commercial warehouse. I stared at the notification while my department head talked about quarterly risk assessments, and I realized with absolute clarity that my family hadn't just mismanaged their own lives. They had spent the last 2 months preparing to legally erase mine to keep Jessica's creditors from locking the doors on her storefront. 3 months before I sat across from that pale bank manager in San Francisco, I stood under a gray canvas tent in a Monterey cemetery, listening to a priest mispronounce my grandmother's middle name. The coastal air carried a sharp bite of salt, and crushed pine needles settling over the small gathering of people who had shown up more for the obligation than the woman. My sister Jessica stood on the opposite side of the casket, holding a single white rose and angling her chin just enough to catch the muted natural light. Jessica was 30 years old and ran a boutique wellness brand in West Hollywood that sold overpriced crystal-infused serums to tourists. She called herself an entrepreneur, but the reality was a failing retail lease funded entirely by our parents, a financial black hole that required constant injections of capital to keep the lights on and the aesthetic flawless. While she carefully adjusted her dark designer sunglasses and discreetly checked her phone screen to see if her camera was recording her solemn profile, I stood silently in a simple wool coat, feeling a hollow ache in my chest that had no audience and required no filter. My grief was private, heavy, and anchored in a lifetime of quiet. Sunday afternoons drinking tea on a weathered porch, not in the validation of internet strangers clicking a heart icon on a screen. Growing up in our household meant learning early that resources were allocated based on performance, and Jessica always played the starring role. When she turned 16, a silver sedan sat in the driveway with a red bow, a reward for simply existing. When I went to college, I filled out financial aid forms by myself at the kitchen table, piecing together grants and night shifts at a medical billing office to cover my textbooks. I learned to calculate interest rates before I learned to drive. Thomas and Linda, our parents, operated under a shared delusion that Jessica was on the verge of a lucrative breakthrough. They envisioned her on magazine covers, while they viewed my steady career in medical compliance as uninspired, ordinary, and lacking ambition. They poured their savings into her business ventures, writing checks to cover her payroll, while I carefully saved portions of my salary in index funds. Evelyn, my grandmother, was the only person who saw the uneven math of our family dynamic. She never handed me cash, but she taught me how to read financial statements, pointing out the subtle discrepancies in ledgers, tracing her finger over columns of ink, and telling me that numbers never bother to lie. They are the only language that remains honest when people get desperate. The reception was held at a nearby hotel ballroom, a room that smelled of stale coffee, damp wool coats, and polite indifference. Linda navigated the space, offering tight, practiced smiles, complaining softly about the quality of the catered sandwiches while adjusting the collar of Jessica's dress. Jessica had retreated to a corner sofa, rapidly typing on her device, uploading a tribute post about generational trauma and healing journeys, soliciting condolences from strangers while ignoring the actual relatives standing 10 feet away. I sat at a small round table near the exit, nursing a cup of lukewarm tea, watching them perform the rituals of a family that only existed in photographs. That is when Thomas walked over. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a memory of the mother he had just buried. He pulled out the chair next to me, sat down and unbuttoned his suit jacket with a sigh, designed to project the heavy burden of the responsible patriarch. He leaned in, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, a tone he usually reserved for discussing business deals he believed were guaranteed to pay out. "Emma," he said, keeping his eyes fixed on the remaining sandwiches on my plate. "The estate lawyer is trying to finalize the preliminary filings by the end of the week. Evelyn left things in a bit of a mess as usual. I'm going to need your social security number and a front and back copy of your driver license just to clear up some routine tax allocations. Nothing major, just crossing the T's, so the state does not tie up the probate process. My compliance training is not just a job, it is a neurological reflex. When you spend 40 hours a week auditing Medicare billing records and identifying fraudulent claim structures, your brain learns to isolate anomalies in human behavior. The anomaly here was glaring. An estate attorney executing a standard probate process does not need a beneficiary's sensitive federal identification numbers passed through a relative on a scrap of paper at a funeral reception. A fiduciary contacts the beneficiary directly through certified mail or a secure portal. I set my teacup down. The porcelain clinked against the saucer, a sharp sound in the quiet corner. "No," I said, keeping my voice level and pleasant. "Have the estate attorney email me the official request on their firm letterhead, and I will provide my documentation directly to their office through a secure encrypted link." Thomas stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The benevolent patriarch routine fractured, revealing a flash of tight, genuine irritation. His jaw shifted. He leaned closer, the smell of peppermint breath mints and nervous sweat suddenly overwhelming. "Emma, please do not make this difficult," he whispered, the edge of his voice sharpening. "We are all grieving. I am just trying to handle the logistics so your mother does not have to worry. Send me the details tonight. It is just family business." I looked him directly in the eyes. "I do not transmit sensitive identification numbers over text message, Dad. Have the lawyer contact me." He stared at me for 3 long seconds. The air between us turned brittle. He recognized that the tactic had failed, but he could not push harder without causing a scene in front of the second cousins mingling near the bar. He stood up, buttoned his jacket with a rigid, jerky motion, and walked away without another word. He went straight to Linda, leaning down to whisper in her ear. Linda shot a quick, hard glance in my direction before smoothing her expression and offering a tray of cookies to a passing guest. I stayed at the reception for another 20 minutes before silently slipping out the side door into the damp coastal evening. I walked to my car, the cold wind off the ocean biting through my coat. I did not cry on the drive back to San Francisco. I drove with the radio off, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt, grounding my thoughts, analyzing that short, strange conversation from every angle. Evelyn had warned me. She had told me that people who run out of their own resources will eventually look for someone else's to harvest. Jessica's storefront was bleeding cash. Thomas was scrambling to maintain the illusion of wealth, and Evelyn had just left behind an estate they assumed they could control. My core philosophy has always been simple. Affection can be fabricated, grief can be staged for an audience, and family loyalty can be weaponized. But ink on paper is immutable. A legal boundary does not care about your feelings, and a bank ledger does not respond to guilt trips. I knew as I parked my car under the streetlights of my neighborhood that Thomas asking for my identity documents was not a clumsy administrative error. It was a test to see how closely I guarded my perimeter. I thought the perimeter was secure. I thought my polite refusal had ended the matter. I underestimated the sheer velocity of their desperation. A week after the funeral, before the reality of Evelyn's absence had even fully settled, my phone lit up with a text message from a distant cousin I had not spoken to in 4 years. The message offered deep sympathies not for the loss of my grandmother, but for my recent struggles with severe addiction, expressing hope that I would find the strength to seek residential treatment. I stared at the screen, sitting perfectly still at my kitchen island, realizing that the skirmish at the funeral had just escalated into a coordinated psychological war. They were not just gossiping, they were actively laying the groundwork for a legal narrative I could not yet see, calculating a way to prove I was unfit to manage my own life. I was sitting at my quartz kitchen island on a Thursday evening, reviewing a stack of outpatient billing records when the screen of my phone illuminated the darkened room. The text message was from a cousin named Lauren, someone who typically only communicated through generic holiday photo cards and polite social media comments. I tapped the notification, expecting a mundane question about a slow-moving probate detail regarding our grandmother. Instead, my eyes scanned a dense, heavily punctuated paragraph that made the ambient hum of my refrigerator suddenly sound very loud. Lauren wrote that she was keeping me in her daily prayers. She mentioned how brave it was to face personal demons, offering her guest room if I needed a safe space to recover from my recent struggles with severe substance dependency. She ended the message by stating Thomas and Linda were heartbroken, but handling my tragic decline with incredible grace. I read the words 3 times. I do not drink alcohol. I have never taken a recreational drug in my life. My idea of a vice is spending too much money on imported espresso beans. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a cold, precise chill settle at the base of my neck. If you grow up in a healthy environment, a message like that is a bizarre misunderstanding, a wrong number, or a clumsy typo. If you grow up in the Johnson household, a message like that is a strategic deployment. Thomas and Linda were not gossiping out of boredom, they were planting seeds. When an estranged relative suddenly believes you are spiraling into addiction, it means a narrative is being carefully curated and distributed behind closed doors. They were building a preemptive consensus among the extended family. If a person is perceived as mentally unstable, paranoid, or addicted, their financial independence becomes highly questionable. Any protest they make against their family is easily dismissed as the ramblings of a sick mind resisting help. My parents were preparing the ground to challenge my basic competency. A different kind of daughter might have dialed Lauren, immediately crying and defending her character against the fabricated allegations. I set the phone face down. My profession involves hunting ghosts in spreadsheets. When a hospital tries to mask a fraudulent billing scheme, they rarely leave a flashing neon sign. They hide the truth inside routine administrative errors and misdirected paperwork. You find the fraud by ignoring the emotional noise and following the raw data. I opened a new browser tab on my laptop. Every Friday morning, out of pure administrative habit, I pull my credit monitoring dashboard to ensure my identity remains secure. I did not wait for Friday. I logged into the portal, bypassed the summary screen, and navigated straight to the detailed inquiry log. My credit score was immaculate, a fortress built over 12 years of disciplined saving and prompt payments. But there, stamped in stark black font under the previous Tuesday date, was a hard credit pull. The inquiring entity was listed as Wilshire Premier Commercial Leasing. Wilshire Boulevard is in Los Angeles. I live nearly 400 miles away in San Francisco, and I owned my condominium outright. I had no reason to apply for commercial real estate in Southern California, but I knew exactly who did. Jessica's crystal-infused wellness boutique was operating out of a cramped secondary retail space in West Hollywood. For months, she had been posting curated images of larger sunlit corner properties, hinting to her dwindling follower base about an upcoming expansion. Commercial landlords in prime Los Angeles districts do not hand over keys based on aesthetic vision boards. They require verified liquid capital, substantial security deposits, and guarantors with spotless financial histories. Jessica's credit was a wasteland of maxed-out revolving retail accounts, and my parents had leveraged their own home twice to fund her previous miscalculations. They lacked the capital to secure that lease. I, however, had just inherited a sizable estate. The psychological suffocation crept in a slow tightening around my ribs. They were not merely trying to coax me into handing over a few $1,000s. They were moving puzzle pieces across a board, attempting to utilize my financial standing without my consent, while simultaneously poisoning my reputation so no one would believe me when the theft finally surfaced. I was standing in the middle of a burning room, and they were the ones holding the matches, telling everyone outside that I had set the fire myself. I did not confront them. I poured a glass of ice water, sat back down at the quartz island, and began compiling the metadata of my own life. I created an encrypted folder on my local drive. I took screenshots of Lauren's text message, saving the timestamp and sender details. I downloaded the PDF of the credit inquiry. I pulled up the public website for Wilshire Premier Commercial Leasing and cross-referenced their available properties with the aesthetic mood boards Jessica had been pinning online. I found the exact corner unit she wanted. The listed monthly rent was exorbitant, requiring a commercial guarantor with millions in verified assets to secure the keys. The pieces clicked together with a sickening mechanical precision. The request for my social security number at the funeral reception was not about probate taxes. Thomas needed my identification to act as a shadow guarantor, or worse, to initiate a transfer of assets to prove liquidity to a Los Angeles leasing agent. He needed my identity to fund Jessica's delusion. The clock on my microwave shifted to 2 a.m. Outside my window, the dense San Francisco fog rolled down the steep incline of the street, swallowing the headlights of a passing cab. I felt a strange crystalline calm settling over my thoughts. The grief of losing Evelyn had been temporarily suspended, replaced by the clinical focus of an ongoing investigation. They assumed I was passive. They assumed my silence was compliance, mistaking my lack of outward drama for a lack of awareness. I closed the laptop, intending to finally get some sleep before my morning audit meeting. Then my phone vibrated against the counter. It was not a text message. It was an automated push notification from my primary banking application. The screen displayed a short clinical sentence: action required regarding pending wire transfer of $3,200,000 to Johnson Family Holdings, LLC. The number hung in the digital glow, a stark quantification of their betrayal. They had bypassed the credit check. They had gone straight for the vault. I did not blink. I picked up the phone, took a screenshot of the notification, and placed it inside the encrypted folder next to Lauren's text and the Wilshire leasing inquiry. The snare had snapped shut, but they had caught the wrong animal. I walked into my bedroom, laid out my professional navy blazer for the morning, and prepared to visit a certain branch manager at First National Bank. I left the First National branch and stepped onto the busy San Francisco pavement. The morning air tasted of exhaust and cold marine layer fog. My smartphone sat heavy inside my coat pocket, feeling like a loaded weapon against my hip. The reflex to dial my father burned in my fingertips. It is a biological instinct to demand an explanation when the people responsible for your safety hold a knife to your back. You want to hear their voice shake over the receiver. You want them to scramble for an apology. I kept my hands firmly gripped around the leather strap of my purse. Calling Thomas and Linda would only alert the thieves that the security alarm had been tripped. A compliance auditor learns early that silence is the most expensive currency in any negotiation. I refused to spend mine on a screaming match. Instead of dialing my parents, I unlocked my car and merged onto Market Street. The drive toward the Civic Center felt suspended in a strange alternate time zone. The world outside my windshield moved in bright, ignorant colors. Pedestrians carried expensive coffee cups and delivery trucks blocked busy intersections. They were going about their Tuesday morning routines entirely unaware that the foundation of my reality had just been quietly hollowed out. I navigated the dense city traffic with mechanical precision. My mind categorized the betrayal not as a family tragedy, but as a severe corporate compliance breach. I needed raw data, and I needed it before they realized I was awake. The county clerk building downtown smelled of floor wax and stale air conditioning. The overhead lighting was harsh, illuminating decades of scuffed linoleum. I pulled a numbered paper ticket from the dispenser and sat in a molded plastic chair. A digital screen flashed numbers in red ink above the counter. It was a mundane room designed for registering birth certificates and property deeds. It was not a place equipped for the quiet devastation of discovering your family had organized a legal syndicate to steal your life savings. When my number flashed, I walked up to the thick glass partition. The clerk was a tired woman chewing peppermint gum with a rhythmic, unbothered cadence. I slid a formal request form through the narrow metal slot. I asked for the public incorporation filings for a newly registered entity named Johnson Family Holdings, LLC. She typed on a keyboard that clacked loudly in the quiet room, her eyes scanning a glowing monitor. She told me to wait. I stood by the counter for 10 minutes. Every second felt like a slow drop of ice water hitting a stone. The clerk returned with a thin manila folder and passed it through the slot. I took the paperwork to a standing desk near the window. I opened the cover. The crisp white pages inside were a masterclass in calculated greed. These were not draft documents. They were filed, stamped, and legally binding articles of organization. My eyes bypassed the boilerplate legal jargon, cutting straight to the structural hierarchy. The filings were cold, precise, ruthless. Section 4 listed the managing members of the company: Thomas, Linda, Jessica. They owned equal shares of the holding entity. My name was nowhere on the operating agreement. I traced the black ink with my index finger as the stark reality struck my chest. This was not a temporary misdirection of funds to secure a commercial lease. This was a permanent acquisition. Once the $3,200,000 crossed the wire from my trust into this corporate shell, the capital belonged exclusively to the LLC. They could drain it to pay Jessica's creditors, buy Los Angeles real estate, or fund their aesthetic lifestyle, and I would have zero legal authority to stop them. They had built a financial vault, locked me out, and used a forged key to shove my inheritance inside. I flipped to the final page of the registry, hunting for the authorization signatures. The state requires a certified notary public to verify the identity of the individuals executing these specific documents. I found the blue ink stamp resting at the bottom corner. Beatrice Shaw. The commission number was registered in San Jose, a city an hour south of my home. My mother had driven to a different county to execute this crime. She had likely worn a coat similar to mine, slid a fabricated identification card across a desk, and smiled at an unsuspecting official. I pulled my phone out and opened the camera application. I hovered the lens over the paperwork. Snap. Page 1. Snap. Page 2. The artificial click of the shutter echoed against the glass window. I felt a strange, hollow sensation taking root behind my ribs. There were no tears. Crying implies a loss of something you once cherished. I was looking at the undeniable proof that my parents did not view me as a daughter. I was not a person with a future, personal dreams or boundaries. I was a balance sheet. I was a dormant asset they felt entitled to liquidate the moment Jessica experienced a cash flow problem. Evelyn had seen this exact hollow space inside her son. She knew he lacked the capacity to love anything he could not spend. I closed the folder and returned it to the clerk with a polite nod. I walked out of the building and back to my parked vehicle. I locked the doors and turned on the engine, letting the heater chase the damp chill out of the cabin. I did not drive away immediately. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name of the attorney I utilized for my own real estate contracts. His name was David. He was sharp, immune to drama, and answered on the second ring. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I informed David that a fabricated power of attorney had been presented to my bank branch. I provided him with the routing details, the holding company name, and the San Jose Notary Commission number. I instructed him to file a silent preliminary fraud report with the state financial regulator. I specifically ordered him not to send a cease and desist letter to my parents. I did not want them to know the bank manager had paused the wire transfer. I wanted them to believe the theft was proceeding flawlessly. David agreed, recognizing the tactical advantage of playing dead while the enemy walked further into the snare. I ended the call and leaned my head against the steering wheel. The board was set. The evidence was secured. But the silence could only hold for so long. They needed that capital to clear the Los Angeles retail space, and their timeline was shrinking rapidly. The pressure was going to force them to make a mistake. Right on cue, the digital display on my dashboard lit up with an incoming call. The name flashing on the screen was Jessica. The favored sibling rarely called me unless she needed someone to applaud her latest vision board or validate her entrepreneurial struggles. But today she was calling to ensure I stayed obedient and quiet while she stole my future. The dashboard screen glowed with my sister's name. I did not tap the steering wheel button to accept the incoming connection. A compliance auditor never enters an interrogation unprepared, and taking a hostile phone call in a moving vehicle offers too many variables. I watched the digital letters blink until the call routed to voicemail. I shifted the car into drive and navigated the steep hills back to my condominium. My home was a quiet sanctuary built on 12 years of steady paychecks and meticulous budgeting. It contained no borrowed furniture, and zero leveraged debt. The confrontation with Jessica was inevitable, but I was going to control the venue, the timing, and the evidentiary record. By Tuesday evening, the coastal fog had thickened outside my living room window, masking the San Francisco skyline in a heavy gray shroud. I sat at the kitchen island, a space that had morphed from a dining area into a forensic laboratory. My laptop screen displayed the photographed LLC documents I had pulled from the county clerk. Next to the keyboard sat a secondary, digital voice recorder I used for transcribing complex medical interviews. I checked the battery levels, tested the microphone input, and placed my smartphone directly next to the device on speaker mode. I poured a glass of ice water. The condensation beaded against the glass in the quiet room. I waited. At 7:14, the phone vibrated against the quartz surface. Jessica was calling again. I pressed the green acceptance icon and simultaneously engaged the digital recorder. The red recording light flickered to life. Jessica did not start with a greeting. She bypassed the standard social protocols and launched directly into a transactional clipped lecture. Her voice lacked the curated soft wellness guru persona she broadcasted to her internet followers. Instead, it carried the sharp, impatient edge of a spoiled teenager demanding a credit card limit increase from a tired parent. Emma. She sighed, a sound engineered to convey deep exhaustion. I really do not have the bandwidth for this kind of dramatic stalling today. The leasing agent for the Wilshire property is demanding the final liquidity verification by Friday. You need to call your bank manager tomorrow morning and release the hold on the trust transfer. You are being deeply selfish right now. I took a slow sip of water. I let a full 3 seconds of silence stretch across the line. Silence makes arrogant people uncomfortable. It forces them to fill the void, often with the exact information you need to hang them. I am being selfish. I asked, keeping my tone flat and neutral, stripping away any defensive anger. Yes, Jessica snapped the audio clipping slightly over the speaker. We all agreed that Evelyn's estate was family money. Dad explicitly told you the plan was to pool the resources into a holding company so we could build generational wealth. My flagship store is the anchor for that strategy. You sitting in San Francisco hoarding the capital out of some petty sibling jealousy is jeopardizing my entire launch timeline. Do you know how hard I have worked to secure this corner unit? The foot traffic alone is essential for my brand expansion. The psychological distortion was breathtaking. She had internalized a fabricated reality where my grandmother's specific legal bequest was merely a communal slush fund waiting to be harvested. She honestly believed that Thomas telling her a lie equated to me giving legal consent. She was treating my $3 million like a shared internet password I had suddenly changed without permission. Her worldview required a central protagonist, and she had cast herself in the role, reducing me to a stubborn obstacle, blocking her inevitable success. I looked at the red blinking light on the voice recorder. I needed her to explicitly tether herself to the fraudulent documents sitting on my hard drive. I employed the stoic witness technique, a method of asking benign, clarifying questions that encourage a suspect to detail their own crimes without realizing they are under investigation. So I said, tracing the edge of a coaster with my index finger, "You and Dad filed the paperwork already. The LLC documents." Obviously, Emma. She groaned, the condescension dripping through the cellular connection. "We handled all the heavy lifting weeks ago. Mom drove down to the Notary to get everything certified so you would not have to deal with the administrative headache. We set up Johnson Family Holdings, filed the articles, and initiated the wire transfer. All you had to do was let it clear, but instead you flagged it. Dad says you are having another one of your paranoid episodes. He says you are not in a healthy state of mind to manage this level of wealth anyway. He thinks you need an intervention." There it was, the vital pebble, captured in crisp digital audio. She had just confessed to the conspiracy. She admitted to the creation of the LLC, acknowledged the unauthorized wire transfer, and placed our mother at the scene of the Notary fraud. Furthermore, she validated the whisper campaign they had launched with cousin Lauren, confirming they were actively using my mental health as a weapon to justify the theft. I want to pause right here and ask you a genuine question. If your sibling called you on a Tuesday night, demanded you empty your bank account to fund their failing business, and casually referred to your inheritance as family money, what would you say back? Would you lose your temper? Would you demand an apology? Tell me your exact response in the comments below, because maintaining discipline in that exact moment requires a very specific kind of steel. I did not scream. I did not inform Jessica that her flagship store was a sinking ship, or that forging a signature on a power of attorney carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. Handing over my anger would only give her a grievance to latch onto. She wanted a fight to prove I was unhinged. I refused to supply the ammunition. Jessica continued her tirade, her voice rising in pitch as she fed on her own manufactured righteous indignation. You need to fix this, Emma. Tomorrow. If I lose the Wilshire deposit because you decided to play victim, I will never forgive you. Mom is in tears because you are tearing this family apart over a technicality. Just release the funds and let Dad handle the accounting. It is the best thing for your recovery anyway. The audacity was almost structural, a towering monument to a lifetime of unchecked entitlement. She genuinely believed she was the injured party. She viewed my boundary as an aggressive attack on her survival. My parents had spent 3 decades shielding her from the concept of consequence, wrapping her in a protective layer of financial bailouts and emotional validation. They had built a monster of fragile narcissism, and now they were attempting to feed me to it. Jessica, I said, cutting through her escalating monologue with a flat, quiet authority. She stopped. What, I am not releasing the bank hold tomorrow? Are you kidding me? She shrieked. Did you hear a single word I just said? The leasing agent is waiting. I heard every single word I replied. My eyes locked on the digital audio waves recording her panic. I have it all documented. Good night. I ended the call before she could formulate another breath. I did not block her number. A good auditor always leaves the channel open for the target to incriminate themselves further. The apartment fell back into a dense, settling quiet. The red light on the digital recorder glowed steadily in the dark kitchen. I pressed the save button, exported the audio file to my encrypted cloud drive, and labeled it with her name and the date. The snare was no longer just set. The tripwire was pulled taut. My family was operating under the assumption that I was a frightened, unstable woman throwing a temporary administrative tantrum. They believed they held the high ground because they had outvoted me 3-1. They failed to realize that in a court of law, a majority vote does not override a felony. The overlapping layers of their scheme were generating a suffocating tension, but the pressure was entirely on their side of the board. They needed the capital by Friday. I merely needed to watch them scramble. After the digital audio file of my sister finished uploading to my secure cloud server, the silence inside my apartment shifted. It was no longer the empty quiet of a solitary evening. It was the pressurized calm that precedes a structural collapse. I stepped away from the quartz kitchen island and walked into the living room, where a single cardboard box sat tucked in the corner near the bookshelf. It contained the few personal effects I had gathered from my grandmother's house the week she passed away. While Thomas and Linda had been busy scouring her property for antique silver and marketable real estate assets, I had packed a box of worn photo albums, loose recipes, and a small wooden jewelry chest that smelled faintly of dried lavender and old cedar. I sat on the hardwood floor and pulled the wooden chest onto my lap. The confrontation with Jessica had verified the current threat, but surviving an audit requires understanding the historical precedent. I opened the hinged lid and bypassed the tangled pearl necklaces and tarnished brooches. My fingers searched the bottom velvet lining until they brushed against a small drawstring pouch. Inside rested a heavy brass key. Its edges were worn smooth from decades of handling, and a faint series of numbers was stamped along the ridge. Holding the metal against my palm triggered a very specific memory from a year ago. It was a late October afternoon in Monterey. The coastal marine layer had burned off early, leaving Evelyn's garden bathed in sharp golden light. She was sitting on a wrought iron bench wearing gardening gloves and holding a pair of pruning shears. Her health had begun to decline, her breathing shallow and measured, but her mind remained an impenetrable fortress. She had waved me over, checked to ensure my parents were occupied inside the house, and pressed this exact brass key into my hand. Her fingers felt cold, but her grip was startlingly firm. "Keep this safe, Emma," she had whispered, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "There is a private vault in Carmel. The account is paid a decade in advance. Do not look inside until the day they try to rewrite history, because they will try. Your father cannot help himself, and your mother will justify every step he takes." I had tucked the key into my pocket that afternoon, assuming she was speaking metaphorically about family squabbles over sentimental heirlooms. Sitting on my living room floor with the weight of the brass in my hand, the sheer scale of her foresight struck me. Evelyn had not been talking about silver spoons. She had been talking about felony wire fraud. She had watched her son operate for 50 years and calculated his exact trajectory. I requested a personal day from my compliance firm the next morning. By 8 o'clock, I was driving south on Highway 1. The California coastline unfurled outside my window, a rugged stretch of jagged cliffs and churning turquoise water. I kept the radio off, letting the rhythmic sound of the tires hum against the asphalt. The drive provided a necessary transition, bridging the gap between the frantic defensive maneuvering in San Francisco and the cold, unearthing truth waiting down the coast. The depository in Carmel was not a commercial retail bank. It was a discreet private security facility tucked behind a row of high-end boutiques catering to clients who valued discretion over convenience. I walked through the reinforced glass doors, presented the brass key alongside my state identification, and signed a visitor log. A quiet attendant in a tailored suit escorted me down a carpeted hallway into a sterile, windowless viewing room. He slid a long metal rectangular box onto the table, offered a polite nod, and closed the heavy door behind him. The lock engaged with a solid, echoing click. I stood alone in the quiet room. The scent of ozone and polished steel hung in the air. I opened the lid. There were no stacks of currency inside. There were no bearer bonds or scattered jewels. Evelyn understood that cash was a temporary shield. Documentation is armor. Resting at the bottom of the metal container was a thick leather binder and a large, heavy parchment envelope. I opened the binder first. The pages were filled with my grandmother's slanted, meticulous handwriting, chronicling decades of financial history. It was a comprehensive ledger of Thomas's ineptitude. Every failed business venture, every bailed-out loan, every missed mortgage payment was recorded with dates, routing numbers, and exact dollar amounts. She had documented the $70,000 he lost on a failed restaurant franchise in the late 90s. She chronicled the secondary mortgage he begged her to cover when his boutique consulting firm collapsed a decade later. She had built a paper trail proving that her son was a financial liability, effectively neutralizing any future claim he might make about being a savvy steward of the family wealth. I turned the page and found a crisp clinical document housed in a plastic sleeve. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation performed by a licensed board-certified geriatric specialist. The date at the top indicated the exam occurred just 4 weeks before Evelyn drafted her final will and testament. The doctor had charted her cognitive functions, memory recall, and spatial awareness, scoring her in the top percentile for her age demographic. The final paragraph was highlighted in yellow ink. It stated unequivocally that Evelyn possessed full, uncompromised testamentary capacity and was entirely free of undue influence or coercion. The brilliance of the document made my chest tighten. Thomas and Linda had been planting seeds among the extended family that I was mentally unstable, laying the groundwork to steal my inheritance. Evelyn knew her son would likely attempt the exact same tactic against her, posthumously claiming she was confused or manipulated when she left the estate solely to me. This certified evaluation was a steel wall blocking that specific legal avenue. She had outsmarted them before they even formed the thought. I closed the binder and reached for the parchment envelope. It was surprisingly heavy. The flap was secured with a dark red wax seal pressed with the ornate initial of our family name. Taped to the front of the parchment was a simple index card containing 2 sentences written in dark blue ink. Do not open this until the day they try to take it from you. Open it in front of a witness. I traced the edge of the wax seal. The grief that had been sitting in my throat for 3 months suddenly transformed. The hollow ache of missing the only relative who cared for me hardened into a dense, unbreakable resolve. I was not navigating this betrayal alone. Evelyn was fighting alongside me from beyond the grave. She had predicted the theft, gathered the necessary ammunition, and handed me the detonator. I sat in the sterile viewing room and read the index card a second time. Open it in front of a witness. My mind began to engineer the required logistics. Evelyn did not want me opening the envelope in isolation because an unverified document can be easily dismissed as a forgery by desperate people. I needed a witness whose authority was recognized by the state. I needed someone whose professional credibility would force the truth onto the public record. My thoughts drifted to the county clerk's office, to the filed LLC incorporation document sitting on my laptop, and to the blue ink stamp resting on the bottom corner of the fraudulent power of attorney. Beatrice Shaw, the independent notary public in San Jose. My mother had utilized Beatrice to execute the crime. It was only fitting that Beatrice served as the official witness to its undoing. The trap I had been silently gathering was about to require a very specific stage, and I knew exactly how to convince a defrauded state official to help me build it. I left the coastal dampness of Carmel behind, merging onto the northbound highway towards San Jose. The heavy parchment envelope rested on the passenger seat tucked safely inside my leather tote. I had the witness requirement explicitly mandated by my grandmother. Now I needed to recruit the specific individual who possessed the state authority to break my parents' scheme apart. San Jose is a sprawling grid of tech campuses and suburban commercial centers, a sharp contrast to the rugged cliffs I had just left. I navigated toward a nondescript strip mall flanked by a dry cleaner and a chain coffee shop. The gold lettering on the glass door read, Beatrice Shaw, Public Notary and Tax Services. I stepped inside. The office smelled of laser printer ozone, weak vanilla air freshener, and the distinct dusty scent of archived tax returns. Behind a neat, unvarnished wooden desk sat Beatrice. She was a woman in her late 60s wearing a structured gray cardigan and wire-rimmed reading glasses perched meticulously on the bridge of her nose. Her posture was rigid, projecting an aura of someone who did not tolerate missing receipts or misplaced commas. She was the exact type of professional who built a career on precision, which meant my mother had selected her specifically because fooling a strict official carried more legal weight than bribing a sloppy one. Beatrice looked up from a stack of forms offering a polite business-like greeting. I did not sit in the client chair immediately. I unzipped my tote bag, pulled out a fresh manila folder, and placed it flat on her desk. I am Emma Johnson, I said, keeping my voice calm and measured. I am here regarding a document you notarized for my family last week. Beatrice frowned slightly, adjusting her glasses. She opened her leather-bound notary journal, running a manicured finger down the columns of dates and signatures. Yes, she replied, her tone shifting into a guarded administrative register. I processed a power of attorney for an LLC transfer. You were in a rush, as I recall. You kept your sunglasses on because you mentioned a recent retinal procedure. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my authentic state-issued identification and my federal passport. I laid them side by side on the desk, directly next to the printed copy of the forged document I had pulled from the county records. I have never had eye surgery, I stated, watching her eyes dart between the photographs. And I was working a shift at a medical compliance firm in San Francisco on the day that stamp was pressed into this paper. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the sudden sharp realization of professional liability. Beatrice leaned forward, her face inches from the items on her desk. She inspected the holographic seal on my driver license. She scrutinized the embedded security threads in the passport page. Then she looked at the signature on the forged power of attorney. The loopy, frantic handwriting did not match the crisp, tight signature verified by the federal government. The color drained from Beatrice's cheeks, rapidly replaced by a creeping deep flush of indignation. Her jaw locked. A notary public relies entirely on their commission. Their seal is their livelihood, their reputation, and their legal shield. To be manipulated into facilitating a felony wire fraud is not just an administrative error. It is a direct catastrophic threat to their career. That woman Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling with a barely contained fury. She had your exact height. She wore a heavy trench coat and oversized frames. She handed me a state ID that scanned perfectly fine on my visual check. She sat in that exact chair and swore under penalty of perjury that she was Emma Johnson. My mother has always been an exceptional actress, I replied, taking a seat across from her. Linda had likely procured a high-quality counterfeit card, using the personal details Thomas had attempted to extract from me at the funeral. When that failed, they used old tax records to fabricate the identity. They needed a stranger to legitimize the theft. Beatrice reached for the black telephone receiver on her desk. I am calling the San Jose Police Department right now. I will not have my commission revoked because your family decided to run a syndicate out of my office. I am reporting this forgery immediately. This was the minor conflict I had anticipated. Beatrice wanted swift, immediate exoneration, but an early police report would ruin the architecture of my defense. I placed my hand gently over the phone base, stopping her before she could dial. If you call the authorities right now, I explained, keeping my tone steady and rational, they will freeze the investigation while lawyers get involved. My father will claim it was a misunderstanding. My sister will scrub her digital footprint. My mother will dispose of the fake ID. They will tie this up in civil litigation for years, and the cloud of suspicion will remain over your notary seal until a judge sorts it out. They might even try to claim you were in on it to save themselves. Beatrice pulled her hand back, her eyes narrowing. She possessed enough experience with human nature to recognize the validity of my assessment. Desperate people cornered by law enforcement will always look for a scapegoat. What do you suggest we do then? She asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I am an accessory to a federal crime, Miss Johnson. I cannot simply pretend this did not happen. I am not asking you to pretend, I said. I am asking you to help me build a trap they cannot walk out of. I need you to host one final meeting. I leaned back in the chair and outlined the strategy. The bank in San Francisco had temporarily halted the wire transfer because I flagged it. My parents and Jessica were currently frantic, desperate to secure the funds before Friday to appease the Los Angeles leasing agent. I needed Beatrice to utilize that desperation. I asked her to call Thomas. As the notary on record, she had a plausible reason to reach out. She would inform him that the bank's fraud department had instituted a standard compliance hold on the LLC formation. To release the $3 million, the bank required one final in-person addendum to be signed by all managing members and the primary beneficiary, in her office, on Friday morning. They will never agree to bring me here, I said, anticipating her objection. They think I am holding the money hostage. But if you tell them the capital is permanently locked, unless I am physically present to sign a release waiver, they will do whatever it takes to drag me into this room. They think they can bully me into submission if they have me outnumbered in front of an official. Beatrice stared at the forged document. The anger in her eyes hardened into something much more useful. It crystallized into a cold, professional vengeance. She picked up her heavy brass notary stamp, turning it over in her hands. They sat in my office and lied to my face, she said, her tone devoid of any warmth. They used my seal to steal your life. Yes, I confirmed. And on Friday we are going to use your seal to hand it back. Beatrice set the brass stamp down with a resounding thud against the wood. She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her and picked up a pen. Give me your father's phone number, she instructed. I will tell him my schedule is wide open on Friday at 10 in the morning. The alliance was forged. The legal ambush was set. I thanked Beatrice, gathered my authentic documents, and walked out into the bright suburban afternoon. The pieces were no longer just on the board. They were actively moving into position. Thomas, Linda, and Jessica were about to walk willingly into a locked room with the very official they had defrauded. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, feeling the profound satisfaction of a carefully executed audit. I reached for my phone to map the route back to San Francisco. But before I could enter the destination, the device vibrated rapidly in my hand. It did not stop. A cascade of notifications flooded the screen one after another, overlapping in a frantic digital wave. Voicemails from aunts, direct messages from cousins. The quiet strategic maneuvering was over. My parents had realized their timeline was collapsing and they had just detonated their social grenade. The phone sat in the center console cup holder, vibrating with a relentless mechanical rhythm. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, navigating the northbound lanes of the highway, while the screen illuminated the dimming interior of the vehicle. It was not a single phone call or a sparse sequence of messages. It was a deluge. My parents had realized their timeline was collapsing following the strategic phone call from Beatrice Shaw. Thomas and Linda understood the bank hold meant the capital was out of their immediate reach, and their response was a synchronized character assassination designed to force my compliance through overwhelming social pressure. I did not touch the device until I parked in the designated space beneath my condominium building in San Francisco. The concrete garage was cool and silent, contrasting sharply with the frantic digital energy glowing on my dashboard. I picked up the phone. The notification banner displayed an unread count exceeding 40 messages. My mother had created a group messaging thread titled Family Support for Emma. She had added 22 participants, including my aunts, uncles, cousins, and several long-standing family friends. I opened the thread. The initial message, authored by Linda, was a calculated masterpiece of weaponized vulnerability. She did not accuse me of theft, because that would invite scrutiny of the financial ledgers. Instead, she framed my refusal to release the funds as a tragic medical emergency. Her text spanned several paragraphs detailing a fabricated history of my declining mental stability. She wrote that the grief of losing Evelyn had triggered a severe paranoid episode, causing me to hoard the family estate out of irrational fear. She claimed she and Thomas were exhausted, terrified for my safety, and simply trying to protect the assets until I could receive inpatient psychiatric care. The replies from the extended family formed a cascading wall of misplaced pity and misdirected outrage. Cousin Sarah typed a long paragraph offering the contact information for a private behavioral facility in Marin County. Uncle Greg sent a stern message instructing me to stop punishing my parents for my own internal struggles. The screen glowed in the dark cabin of my car, casting a pale blue light across my hands. Watching your own reputation burn in real time is a deeply surreal sensory experience. The specific chime of the iPhone echoed off the concrete walls, with each new arrival delivering another layer of manufactured consensus. Then the voicemails began to arrive. I tapped the audio icon and listened to Aunt Diane. Her voice carried a familiar, authoritative edge, softened by a patronizing layer of concern. "Emma, honey," she sighed heavily into the receiver. "Your mother is in tears. She cannot sleep knowing you are spiraling like this. You need to submit to their guardianship temporarily. Let Thomas handle the business logistics so you can focus on healing your mind. Do not ruin your life and bankrupt your sister over a delusion. We all love you, but this has to stop." This was the exact methodology my parents had utilized throughout my childhood to manage external threats. When a neighbor once threatened a lawsuit over a disputed property line, Thomas did not hire a surveyor to prove his case. Linda baked cookies, visited the surrounding houses, and quietly seeded a rumor that the complaining neighbor was suffering from early-onset dementia. Within weeks, the neighborhood association dismissed the boundary complaint out of misplaced sympathy, and the neighbor moved away a year later. My parents understood that facts rarely matter when a compelling emotional narrative is introduced first. They were currently executing that same playbook on a much grander scale, utilizing the group chat as a courtroom where they served as both the prosecution and the judge. The psychological weight of 22 people demanding your surrender is designed to induce panic. It is engineered to make the target feel so isolated and universally condemned that they abandon their boundaries just to restore social harmony. A younger version of myself might have drafted a frantic defensive essay detailing the forged power of attorney and the fake identification card. I might have attached the audio recording of Jessica demanding the money to prove my sanity. But attempting to present evidence to a jury that has already delivered a verdict is a useless expenditure of energy. I turned off the vehicle engine and walked toward the elevator bank. The phone continued to chime in my hand. Every notification was another thread in the web they were weaving. Rather than fighting the web, I decided to archive it. I entered my apartment, walked straight to the kitchen island, and opened my secure cloud drive. I took sequential screenshots of the entire group message, capturing every timestamp, every participant name, and every slanderous allegation Linda had authored. I exported the audio file of Aunt Diane, suggesting a forced guardianship. I uploaded every piece of incoming data into the designated evidence folder. I felt a profound shift occurring in my chest. The residual sting of family betrayal evaporated, leaving behind a cold, clinical clarity. They were giving me the exact documentation required to demonstrate a coordinated campaign of coercion and defamation. My compliance training took over the emotional response. An auditor does not argue with the suspect during the discovery phase. An auditor collects the ledgers, catalogs the discrepancies, and waits for the formal hearing. I sat on a velvet stool near the counter, pouring a glass of cold water. I watched the messages continue to populate the screen. Jessica chimed in, playing the role of the wounded but forgiving younger sibling, asking everyone to pray for my swift recovery, so her wellness boutique could proceed without the burden of my toxicity. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also strategically blind. They felt invincible, surrounded by the echo chamber they had constructed. I opened the text input box at the bottom of the group thread. I did not address the accusations of paranoia. I did not mention the forged signature or the impending commercial lease in Los Angeles. I kept my response devoid of emotion, stripped of any defensive posture, and focused entirely on the logistical trap Beatrice Shaw had prepared. I tapped the glass keyboard, constructing a single chillingly polite sentence. I will meet you at Beatrice Shaw Notary office on Friday at 10 in the morning to finalize the trust documents. I pressed send. I watched the small green bubble appear at the very bottom of the long, scrolling list of accusations. I did not offer any further context or explanation. I simply confirmed my attendance at the location they believed would secure their victory. The effect was instantaneous. The relentless chiming of my phone ceased. The group chat fell into a sudden, profound digital silence. The abrupt halt in communication told me everything I needed to know. Behind closed doors, Thomas and Linda were scrambling to interpret my response. They likely viewed my terse message as a white flag of surrender, assuming the social pressure had successfully broken my resolve. They believed their intervention had worked and that I was arriving on Friday to sign away my grandmother's estate to the holding company. I locked the screen of my phone and placed it face down on the quartz counter. The apartment returned to its quiet, peaceful state. Outside the window, the San Francisco streetlights illuminated the gathering evening fog. The exquisite anticipation of the looming reckoning settled over the room. My parents had assembled an audience to witness my downfall, but they had inadvertently guaranteed that their own exposure would be a matter of public record. The snare was fully armed, and they were walking toward it with confident, enthusiastic strides. The heavy coastal rain washed the San Francisco streets on Thursday night, creating a steady rhythmic drumming against my living room windows. Inside the apartment was a sanctuary of controlled silence. The frantic notifications from the family group chat had ceased 24 hours earlier, leaving a digital void my parents incorrectly interpreted as my submission. They spent their evening celebrating a premature victory. I spent mine organizing the architecture of their ruin. I wiped down the quartz kitchen island, removing any trace of clutter, and began placing the physical artifacts of the investigation across the smooth surface. A compliance auditor knows that presenting evidence requires sequence and visual weight. If you overwhelm a target with disorganized paperwork, they find room to argue. If you lay the facts out like stepping stones, they have no choice but to walk the path you paved. First, I set down the photocopy of the forged withdrawal authorization form I had acquired from the First National branch manager. The harsh overhead lighting caught the blue ink of the fraudulent signature. Next to it, I placed the articles of organization for Johnson Family Holdings. The crisp pages from the county clerk detailed the exact structural hierarchy Thomas, Linda, and Jessica had built to siphon my inheritance. Beside the corporate filings, I positioned a single sheet of heavy bond paper. During my meeting with Beatrice Shaw in San Jose, the notary had drafted and signed a sworn affidavit detailing the physical description of the woman who impersonated me. The document explicitly stated that a fabricated state identification card was presented to secure her official stamp. It was a formal admission of professional deception, and it carried the crushing legal authority of an officer of the state. Next in the sequence was a small silver USB flash drive. It contained the exported audio recording of Jessica demanding the release of the trust funds. The digital file preserved her explicit acknowledgement of the illicit LLC and her casual admission that our mother had facilitated the paperwork. The metal casing of the drive felt cold against my fingertips. Finally, at the center of the arrangement, I placed the thick parchment envelope retrieved from the private depository in Carmel. The dark red wax seal remained unbroken, bearing the ornate initial of my grandmother. Evelyn had engineered this specific artifact to act as the final lock on the trap. I did not know the exact contents of the pages hidden inside, but I trusted the woman who had spent 84 years studying the flaws in our family. The envelope was the centerpiece, the undeniable proof of premeditation on all sides. I stood back and surveyed the island. 5 distinct pieces of evidence, 5 unyielding facts. With the documentation sequenced, I turned my attention to my physical presentation. Confrontations of this magnitude require uniform. You do not walk into a hostile audit wearing casual clothing. You wear garments that project institutional authority. I retrieved a tailored navy blue blazer from my closet, a piece I reserved specifically for high-stakes regulatory meetings. I set up the ironing board in the living room, filling the iron reservoir with distilled water. The hiss of the steam pressing into the wool fabric provided a grounding mechanical cadence. As I guided the hot iron along the structured lapels, my mind drifted away from the impending Friday morning appointment and snagged on a memory from 14 years ago. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late August. I was 18, sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by printed student loan promissory notes. I was trying to calculate how many hours I needed to work at the campus library to cover the remaining tuition gap. The front door opened and Jessica bounded into the house, clutching a set of keys with a leather dealership tag. She was 16. Thomas and Linda followed closely behind, beaming with parental pride. They had just signed a lease on a brand new silver sedan for her birthday. I remembered watching them celebrate in the foyer, while I held a cheap ballpoint pen, staring at a document that would indebt me for the next decade. When I asked Thomas if he had time to review my loan application, he waved his hand dismissively, stating that navigating financial aid builds character and teaches self-reliance. He then handed Jessica a pristine gas card. That memory was not rooted in petty sibling jealousy. It was the fundamental blueprint of our household inequality. My parents had decided very early that my sister was an asset, requiring constant investment, while I was a utility designed to absorb the deficits. They groomed Jessica to expect seamless luxury without effort. They trained me to survive on margins. The irony was poetic. By forcing me to navigate complex financial bureaucracies alone, they had inadvertently forged the exact skill set I was now using to dismantle their theft. They had paid for Jessica to have a car. They had forced me to learn how to read the fine print. I hung the pristine blazer on a wooden hanger, placing it on the back of a chair near the front door. I packed the manila folder containing the 5 pieces of evidence into my leather portfolio. Every zipper, every seam, every document was checked and secured. The logistical execution of the defense was finalized. There was no room left for rambling emotions or second-guessing. The math was verified. That night, I turned off the lamps in the apartment and climbed into bed. People often assume the night before a monumental confrontation is filled with tossing, turning, and anxious sweating. But anxiety is the byproduct of uncertainty. When you do not know what the enemy holds, you stay awake, trying to anticipate their strike. I knew exactly what Thomas, Linda, and Jessica were bringing to the table in San Jose. They were bringing a fabricated narrative, a sense of unearned superiority, and a desperate need to finalize a commercial lease. They were bringing a house of cards. I was bringing a sledgehammer. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain tapping against the glass. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. It was a deep, dreamless rest, the kind of profound sleep that only arrives when the mind accepts that the preparation is over and the execution is inevitable. When my alarm sounded at 6 o'clock on Friday morning, the storm had passed. The sky over the bay was a crisp, clear blue. I showered, dressed in the white blouse and the navy blue blazer, and drank a single cup of black coffee. I did not check the family group thread. I did not look at my incoming text messages. The external noise no longer mattered. I picked up the leather portfolio, feeling the satisfying weight of the parchment envelope inside. I locked the door to my condominium and walked down to the garage. The drive to San Jose would take roughly an hour. My family was already making the same journey from their respective homes, rehearsing their speeches, adjusting their performative expressions, and congratulating themselves on successfully breaking my will. They were walking blindly toward a concrete wall at full speed, and I was holding the only map that showed the dead end. I merged onto the highway, keeping the vehicle slightly below the speed limit. There was no need to rush. The trap was set, the witness was waiting, and the documents were ready to speak on my behalf. I just had to show up and let the paper do the work. The drive down the peninsula took precisely 50 minutes. The San Jose morning sun was already baking the asphalt outside the nondescript commercial plaza, casting sharp shadows across the parking lot. I parked my vehicle 2 spaces away from my father's pristine luxury sport utility vehicle. It was a recent model he leased by leveraging the remaining equity in their primary residence, a rolling testament to his priorities. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusted the lapels of my tailored navy blazer, and retrieved the leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. My pulse was a steady rhythmic metronome. There was no fear, only the cold anticipation of a mathematical equation balancing itself out. The chime above the glass door of the notary office announced my arrival. The interior space felt distinctly different from my initial visit 2 days prior. The weak vanilla air freshener now fought a losing battle against the sharp scent of expensive cologne and the invisible friction of contained anxiety. They were already seated around the polished mahogany conference table, occupying the back half of the room, positioned like a corporate board awaiting the arrival of a subordinate. Thomas claimed the center chair facing the entrance. He wore a tailored charcoal suit designed to camouflage his age, his posture broadcasting the relaxed, expansive confidence of a gambler holding a royal flush. Linda sat to his right, clutching a designer leather handbag onto her lap like a protective shield. Her face was locked into a tight, practiced expression that crinkled the edges of her eyes without conveying a single ounce of genuine warmth. Jessica occupied the left side, dressed in high-end athletic wear, slouching against the high-backed leather chair. Her attention remained glued to the glowing screen of her smartphone, her thumb swiping rhythmically, communicating a profound boredom with the administrative chore of claiming my inheritance. "Ah, there she is!" Thomas announced, his voice booming across the small room. He stood up, buttoning his jacket, projecting an aura of magnanimous forgiveness. He adopted the tone of a benevolent patriarch welcoming a lost child back into the fold. "We were starting to worry traffic had tied you up. Have a seat, Emma. Let us get this sorted out." I did not return his greeting. I did not acknowledge Linda's fragile smile or Jessica's exasperated sigh as she finally placed her device face down on the wood grain. I walked to the solitary empty chair positioned directly across from my father. I sat down, placed my portfolio flat on the table, and rested my hands on top of the smooth leather. I employed the stoic witness technique, maintaining a neutral, unreadable expression. I offered them absolute silence, forcing them to fill the acoustic void with their own fabricated narrative. Thomas interpreted my silence as capitulation. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, clasping his hands together in a gesture engineered to project earnest sincerity. "I want to say how proud I am of you for coming today." He began, his tone dripping with paternal condescension. "We know the last few months have been difficult. Grief does strange things to the mind, and you have been carrying a heavy burden. But you are finally seeing reason. You are taking the necessary steps to protect the family, and that is what Evelyn would have wanted. Linda nodded vigorously, her knuckles turning white around the straps of her purse. "We just want you to heal, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice trembling with manufactured empathy. "This holding company is going to secure our future. It removes the stress of financial management from your shoulders, so you can focus on getting your health back on track. We are doing this together." Jessica rolled her eyes, drumming her manicured fingernails against the table. "Can we please fast forward through the emotional therapy session? I have a vendor meeting at noon, and the leasing agent in Los Angeles is breathing down my neck. I need this compliance hold lifted today, or the Wilshire property goes to a competitor. Just sign the waiver, Emma, so we can all move on with our lives." At the head of the conference table sat Beatrice Shaw. She wore the same structured gray cardigan from our previous encounter, her wire-rimmed glasses catching the glare of the overhead fluorescent lights. Her brass notary seal rested a few inches from her right hand, a silent sentinel waiting for deployment. Her expression was entirely unreadable. She betrayed no hint of the professional fury that had consumed her 48 hours prior. She played the role of the impartial bureaucratic functionary flawlessly shuffling a stack of legal documents into a neat pile. "The bank requires a wet signature on this specific addendum to clear the fraud alert on the LLC transfer," Beatrice stated, her voice clipped and professional. "Because the initial wire authorization was flagged, standard protocol dictates that all managing members and the original account holder verify their consent in the presence of a commissioned officer." Thomas smiled a wide, predatory grin that exposed his teeth. "Exactly," he said, turning his attention back to me. "It is just a routine administrative hurdle, a minor hiccup in the process." He pushed his chair back slightly, expanding his physical presence in the room. "You have to understand the bigger picture, Emma. That capital sitting in a dormant trust does nothing but gather dust. By rolling it into Johnson Family Holdings, we are building a legacy. Jessica's flagship store is going to anchor a nationwide brand. This money ensures her success, which in turn secures a revenue stream for all of us. You are providing the foundation for your sister's empire. It is a noble sacrifice, and we will make sure you are taken care of once the profits start rolling in." The irony saturating the room was thick enough to choke on. They sat there bathed in the delusion of their own superiority, convinced they had successfully cornered their weak, unstable sibling into surrendering her autonomy. They believed the coordinated social pressure of the family group chat had shattered my resolve. They thought I was a broken instrument they could finally tune to their exact specifications. They were so blinded by their own greed, they failed to notice the structural integrity of the room had shifted the moment I walked through the door. Thomas reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit and extracted a heavy silver fountain pen. He uncapped it with a soft click. He picked up the stack of transfer addendums Beatrice had prepared and slid them across the polished mahogany. The crisp white paper stopped inches from my hands. He placed the silver pen deliberately on top of the signature line. "All you have to do is sign your name right there," he instructed gently. "And this whole ugly misunderstanding goes away forever." The air in the office grew stagnant. 4 pairs of eyes watched me. Jessica tapped her foot impatiently against the carpet. Linda held her breath. Thomas maintained his benevolent smile. Beatrice kept her hand resting near the brass seal. I looked down at the documents. I looked at the silver fountain pen reflecting the fluorescent light. I did not reach for either. Instead, I pulled the zipper on my leather portfolio. The metallic rasp sliced through the quiet room. I reached inside and bypassed the forged withdrawal form, the LLC filings, and the sworn affidavit. My fingers found the thick parchment paper. I pulled the envelope out and placed it flat on the table. The dark red wax seal faced the ceiling, the ornate initial of my grandmother catching the light. The heavy paper felt substantial, carrying the weight of a truth that had been buried in a private depository waiting for this exact moment. I kept my hand resting on top of it, feeling the rough texture of the parchment beneath my palm. I pushed the envelope slowly toward the center of the mahogany table. It glided across the wood with a soft scraping sound, coming to a halt directly beside the stack of transfer documents. The heavy parchment sat isolated in the center of the polished wood, a stark contrast to the sterile stack of laser-printed transfer documents my father had just offered me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, leaning back slightly into the leather chair. The ambient noise of the suburban plaza outside vanished, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning unit circulating cold air through the small office. Before I affix my signature to any legal instrument today, I said, looking directly past Thomas and focusing my gaze on the notary public at the head of the table, I have a specific directive to fulfill. My grandmother requested this envelope be opened exclusively by a commissioned officer of the state, in the physical presence of the primary beneficiaries on the occasion that the integrity of her estate was ever challenged. Thomas frowned. The benevolent, expansive posture he had maintained since my arrival fractured. A sharp, vertical line appeared between his eyebrows. He glanced at the red wax seal, his eyes narrowing as his mind attempted to calculate the trajectory of this unexpected variable. "Emma, what is this?" he asked, his voice losing its previous warmth, replaced by a thin, tight edge of genuine irritation. "We are dealing with banking compliance protocols right now, not sentimental letters. We do not have time for theatrical delays." I did not answer him. I kept my eyes locked on Beatrice Shaw. She reached across the mahogany table and pulled the parchment toward her. She examined the unbroken wax seal, running her thumb over the embossed initial. As a sworn officer of the state, Beatrice stated, her tone shifting into a resonant, unyielding authority. "I am obligated to execute the documented wishes of a testator when presented with secured, verifiable instructions regarding their estate." She picked up a steel letter opener from her desk organizer. She slid the metal edge under the flap. The brittle snap of the dark red wax breaking apart echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Linda jumped slightly in her seat. Jessica stopped tapping her foot, her attention finally breaking away from the digital screen in her hand to stare at the unfolding scene. Beatrice extracted a thick folded sheaf of premium bond paper. She adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, unfolded the pages, and scanned the introductory paragraph. Her posture straightened. When she began to read, her voice projected across the conference table, carrying the undeniable weight of a ghost delivering a final verdict. "This is a sworn, notarized affidavit executed by Evelyn Margaret Johnson," Beatrice announced, noting the date stamped at the top margin. "It was recorded and sealed precisely 24 months ago." Thomas shifted in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He opened his mouth to object, to demand the document be handed over for his personal inspection, but Beatrice raised her hand, silencing him with a sharp, uncompromising glare. She lowered her eyes back to the paper and began reading my grandmother's words aloud. "I, Evelyn Margaret Johnson, being of sound mind and absolute clarity, execute this affidavit to serve as a permanent record regarding the disposition of my estate. I have directed the entirety of my financial assets into an irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of my granddaughter Emma Johnson. I have made this decision based on a lifetime of observing the financial depravity and moral bankruptcy of my son Thomas and his wife Linda." Linda let out a short, high-pitched gasp, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Thomas froze, his jaw slackening as the brutal, unvarnished truth of his mother's assessment washed over the room. Beatrice did not pause for their reactions. She continued reading, her cadence steady and merciless. "Thomas possesses an insatiable entitlement masquerading as ambition. I have spent decades watching him cannibalize every resource within his reach to fund a lifestyle he has never earned. I possess a profound certainty that upon my passing, he will attempt to circumvent the boundaries of my trust. Because he cannot win a legal challenge regarding my mental competency, he will resort to fraudulent methodology. I explicitly predict that Thomas and Linda will attempt to fabricate Emma's consent, utilizing forged signatures and misrepresentation to siphon her inheritance into their own failing enterprises." The air pressure inside the office plummeted. My grandmother had reached across time, bypassing the grave to shine a blinding spotlight onto the exact blueprint of their crime. She had not merely suspected their greed, she had diagnosed it with clinical precision. But Evelyn had not stopped at a character assassination. She was a woman who understood that opinions require evidentiary support. Beatrice turned to the second page of the affidavit. To preempt this inevitable theft, Beatrice read, "I have commissioned a certified forensic baseline analysis of Emma's authentic signature, conducted by a licensed graphologist, utilizing 10 years of verified historical documentation. This analysis is attached hereto, detailing the exact spatial relationships, pen pressure metrics, and structural loops unique to my granddaughter's handwriting. Any document presented by Thomas or Linda bearing a signature that deviates from these established biometric markers must be treated as a criminal forgery." Beatrice lowered the heavy bond paper. She reached across her desk and picked up the photocopy of the withdrawal authorization form my parents had submitted to the bank in San Francisco. She placed it side by side with the forensic schematic Evelyn had provided. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, the sound of a fabricated reality hitting a concrete floor and shattering into dust. Beatrice looked at the loopy, panicked ink on the bank form and then looked at the crisp structural analysis provided by the graphologist. The discrepancy was not a matter of opinion. It was a documented, irrefutable fact certified by an expert and sealed by a deceased matriarch. I unzipped my leather portfolio. It was my turn to deal the final hand. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology, because an auditor knows that anger only gives the guilty a distraction. I reached inside and pulled out the crisp pages of the county clerk filings. I laid the metadata of Johnson Family Holdings, LLC, in front of my father. "You formed this corporate entity 3 weeks ago," I said, my voice smooth and flat. "You listed yourselves as the sole managing members. You built a vault to hold stolen capital." I reached into the portfolio again, retrieving a printed transcript of the digital audio file, placing the small silver flash drive on top of the paper. I slid it toward my sister. "On Tuesday night, Jessica called me and explicitly admitted that the three of you orchestrated this transfer." I continued, watching her eyes widen in horror as she stared at the transcription of her own arrogant demands. She confessed that Linda was the one who traveled to San Jose to execute the paperwork, attempting to bypass my refusal to release the funds. Finally, I produced the sworn statement Beatrice had drafted 48 hours prior. I placed it in the center of the table. "And this," I concluded, "is a formal declaration from the notary public sitting at the head of this table. It states that an older woman wearing sunglasses and a heavy coat presented a fabricated state identification card in this very room, committing felony identity theft to secure an official seal." Thomas stared at the document spread across the mahogany grain. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin the exact pale color of wet cement. His hands, previously clasped in a posture of benevolent control, now rested limp and shaking against his thighs. The confident, expansive patriarch had vanished, replaced by a terrified man staring at the undeniable architecture of his own imprisonment. Jessica's fingers trembled so violently she lost her grip on her smartphone. The device slipped from her hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, clattering smack. She did not reach down to retrieve it. She stared at the silver flash drive, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid, her chest heaving as the consequences of her entitlement finally materialized in the real world. Linda squeezed her eyes shut, tears of pure, unadulterated panic spilling over her eyelashes, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She curled inward, wrapping her arms around her stomach, as if bracing for a physical impact. The wall clock above the door ticked with a relentless mechanical rhythm, each second stretching the agony of their exposure. They were trapped in a windowless room, surrounded by their own lies, facing a daughter they had severely underestimated and a state official they had foolishly defrauded. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He looked at the locked door, then back to the mountain of evidence, his eyes darting frantically as his mind desperately searched for a secondary exit, an excuse, a negotiation tactic to crawl out of the snare. He was about to discover that the trap was far deeper than a simple confrontation across a desk. Thomas stared at the array of documentation resting on the polished wood. The illusion of his control shattered, replaced by the frantic, unpredictable energy of a cornered predator realizing the exits are sealed. He let out a sharp, breathless sound, a noise caught somewhere between a scoff and a gasp. Then he lunged, his torso stretched across the mahogany, his hands scrambling to gather the spread of papers. He clawed at the county clerk filings, attempting to snatch the printed audio transcript and the forensic graphology report. His elbow clipped the silver fountain pen he had offered me moments earlier. It clattered onto the floor, the cap dislodging, spilling a dark pool of ink into the beige carpet. "Emma, stop this right now!" Thomas barked, his voice cracking, shedding the polished, patriarchal tone for raw, unfiltered desperation. "You are being dramatic. You are taking a simple misunderstanding and blowing it out of proportion. Give me these files. We do not need outside interference. We are a family, and we can handle this privately as a family." He crumpled the edge of Beatrice's sworn affidavit in his fist, pulling it toward his chest, as if destroying the physical paper would somehow erase the digital records stored securely on my encrypted drives. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, expecting me to flinch, expecting the ingrained childhood conditioning to kick in and force my submission. I did not move a single muscle. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly on the arms of the leather chair. I watched him scramble, observing his panic, with the detached clinical interest of a scientist watching a chemical reaction burn itself out. The documents on the table were merely high-quality copies. The originals were safe inside a fireproof vault at my attorney's office. Thomas could eat the paper in front of me and it would not change a single data point. I shifted my gaze away from my father's frantic display and looked directly at Beatrice Shaw. She sat rigid at the head of the conference table, her expression carved from granite. She did not attempt to wrestle the crumpled documents away from him. Instead, she reached toward the digital console of her desk telephone. She extended one manicured finger and pressed a glowing red button on the keypad. A heavy metallic thud echoed through the small office. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a magnetic electronic deadbolt engaging. The main glass door leading out to the suburban plaza was now sealed shut. "I already have," Beatrice said. Her voice was ice devoid of any sympathy, delivering the final verdict to the man who thought he could use her professional seal to facilitate a theft. Before Thomas could process her words or register the sound of the locked door, the handle of the adjacent conference room turned. The solid oak panels swung inward. Two men stepped out of the adjoining space, bringing a sudden, suffocating weight into the already cramped environment. The first man wore a tailored charcoal suit that mirrored my father's aesthetic, but his posture carried genuine authority rather than hollow bravado. He held a leather folio and possessed the stern, unyielding expression of a corporate executive who dealt exclusively in risk mitigation. The second man was dressed in plain clothes, a dark sweater and slacks, but he moved with the unmistakable balanced gait of federal law enforcement. A gold shield hung from a lanyard around his neck, reflecting the harsh overhead fluorescent bulbs. Thomas dropped the crumpled papers. The pages fluttered down to the mahogany surface. He staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "I am Director Mitchell, Regional Head of Fraud Operations for First National," the man in the suit announced, stepping up to the edge of the conference table. He did not offer a handshake. He looked at my parents with the disdain usually reserved for a hazardous spill. "And this is Special Agent Reynolds. We have been monitoring the audio feed of this meeting from the adjoining room for the past 40 minutes. Linda let out a high, thin wail. Her hands flew to her throat, her designer purse slipping off her lap and crashing onto the floor. Jessica sat frozen, the color draining from her face, her eyes darting between the gold badge and the locked exit door. The arrogant wellness entrepreneur who had demanded my inheritance mere days ago was suddenly reduced to a trembling, terrified spectator. The realization that her Los Angeles flagship store was dead, along with her curated internet persona, washed over her in a visible wave of shock. "Your attorney contacted our internal investigations unit on Tuesday." Miss Johnson. Director Mitchell continued, turning his attention briefly to me. "When we verified the discrepancy in the signature profile, we placed a hard freeze on the $3 million transfer. However, because the attempted theft crossed state lines via digital wire authorization and exceeded the threshold for grand larceny, our compliance division was mandated to notify federal authorities. Special Agent Reynolds stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet, factual delivery of his words carried enough force to shatter whatever remained of my family's delusion. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Reynolds said, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. Under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343, executing a scheme to defraud a financial institution via electronic communication is classified as wire fraud. When the amount exceeds $1 million, it escalates to a major federal offense. We are no longer dealing with a probate dispute or a family disagreement. You attempted to misappropriate a seven-figure sum using a fabricated identity and a fraudulent power of attorney. The gravity of the statute crushed the remaining oxygen out of the room. A civil lawsuit means hiring defense lawyers and negotiating settlements. A federal indictment means mandatory minimum sentencing, frozen assets, and the immediate destruction of any social standing you possess. The carefully curated narrative my parents had built for decades, the illusion of their wealth, the aesthetic superiority they weaponized against the extended family, it was all dissolving into criminal charges. Linda began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved, her breaths coming in short, erratic gasps. The performative tears she had utilized throughout my childhood to manipulate situations were gone, replaced by the ugly, visceral sobbing of a woman realizing her actions finally had inescapable consequences. She lunged toward me, falling to her knees beside my chair. She grabbed the sleeve of my navy blazer, her fingers digging into the wool fabric. "Emma, please," she begged, her voice a ragged, hysterical shriek. "Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized it and we just filed the paperwork incorrectly. You have to call them off. We are your parents. You cannot send us to prison over this. I am your mother." I looked down at the woman gripping my arm. For 32 years, she had watched her husband drain our resources, she had prioritized my sister's comfort over my basic needs, and she had driven to this very office with a fake identification card to steal the only security I had left. She was not crying out of remorse for the betrayal. She was crying because the snare had closed around her own ankle. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my sleeve. I did not offer her a comforting lie. I did not engage in the emotional theater she desperately required to survive the moment. I reached across the table and began gathering my verified documents. I picked up the printed graphology report, the county clerk filings, and the transcription of Jessica's audio confession. I aligned the edges of the paper, tapping them against the wood to create a neat, uniform stack. I placed the documents back inside my leather portfolio. I picked up the heavy parchment envelope holding Evelyn's final testament and tucked it safely into the interior pocket. I pulled the metallic zipper shut. The crisp, grinding sound of the teeth locking together signaled the official conclusion of my involvement. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my blazer. I looked at Thomas, who was staring blankly at the wall, paralyzed by the sight of the federal agent. I looked at Jessica, who was curled into a tight ball in her chair, weeping silently into her hands. I looked at Linda, still kneeling on the carpet, her face streaked with mascara. "I cannot call them off." "Linda," I said, my voice carrying the steady, unbothered cadence of a professional delivering a final quarterly report. "I am just the auditor." The math did not add up. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. I walked toward the electronic door. Beatrice pressed the release button on her console, and the magnetic lock disengaged with a heavy click. I pushed the glass open and stepped out into the blinding San Jose sunlight, leaving the three of them trapped in that windowless room, with the federal authorities forced to finally balance the ledger they had spent their entire lives trying to cheat. 90 days is a remarkably brief window of time to watch a lifetime of curated illusions dismantle themselves. Walking out of that notary office into the bright San Jose sun did not signify the end of the conflict. It represented the exact second the federal government took the reins. When financial investigators open an inquiry involving a grand larceny attempt across state lines, the machinery of justice moves with a grinding, unyielding precision. The fallout was not driven by revenge. It was driven by the cold mechanical application of the law. Within 48 hours of the confrontation, every financial account tied to Thomas and Linda was frozen tight. The federal injunction locked their checking balances, retirement portfolios, and emergency savings behind a bureaucratic wall, pending a comprehensive forensic audit. The immediate reality of their frozen capital struck their daily routine like a blunt instrument. The luxury sport utility vehicle Thomas had parked outside Beatrice Shaw office building disappeared first. A repossession agent arrived quietly early one Tuesday morning, hooking the pristine bumper to a tow truck and hauling the leased status symbol down the street. Their primary residence, a sprawling property burdened by secondary mortgages used to fund my sister. Prior mistakes quickly followed the same trajectory. Without access to their liquid capital, my parents missed the first payment. Then the second payment lapsed. By the third month, the lending institution initiated formal foreclosure proceedings. The manicured lawn they used to pay a professional landscaping crew to maintain grew tall and ragged, a visible indicator of their sudden insolvency. Thomas, a man who once held court at local restaurants projecting the image of a wealthy patriarch, found his credit cards declined at the neighborhood grocery store. The dominoes continued falling southward toward Los Angeles. The Wilshire commercial leasing agent grew tired of Jessica's frantic stalling tactics and awarded the prime corner property to a competing franchise. But the damage extended far beyond a lost expansion opportunity. The crystal-infused wellness boutique in West Hollywood relied entirely on Thomas and Linda pouring monthly cash infusions into the operating budget. When the parents' accounts locked, the boutique payroll bounced. Suppliers halted shipments of organic serums and imported inventory. The landlord, lacking patience for missed rent checks, taped a bright pink eviction notice to the glass storefront, effectively ending the entrepreneurial charade. Jessica had spent years projecting the image of a successful independent founder to her internet followers, but more importantly, to her husband. Ryan was a corporate software engineer who believed he had married into a stable, wealthy lineage. He remained oblivious to the underlying rot until federal agents contacted him regarding his wife's financial ledgers. The probe unearthed much more than a forged trust document. The investigators exposed $80,000 in high-interest retail debt Jessica had hidden across multiple secret credit lines to maintain her affluent aesthetic. The revelation shattered the foundation of their marriage. Ryan did not stay to help her rebuild or offer unconditional support. He packed his belongings, hired a ruthless litigator, and filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable financial deception. The golden child found herself facing federal charges, a shuttered business, and a dissolved marriage, all within a single fiscal quarter. The social theater my parents had weaponized against me experienced a similarly devastating collapse. For weeks following the Notary ambush, the family group chat remained dormant. The aunts, uncles, and cousins who had eagerly participated in my character assassination lacked the courage to ask why the trust transfer never finalized. Their ignorance evaporated on a Thursday morning when the Regional Business Journal published its weekly digest of financial crimes. The brief factual column occupied a small corner of page 4. It outlined the indictment of Johnson Family Holdings, detailing the use of a forged notary seal and a fabricated state identification card to attempt a 7-figure wire fraud. The publication utilized raw facts devoid of emotional spin. It named Thomas and Linda. It named Jessica. It did not mention paranoia, mental breakdowns, or forced guardianships. It simply reported the felony charges and the pending trial dates. My smartphone, which had once vibrated incessantly with demands for my surrender, transformed into a brick of profound silence. Aunt Diane never called to apologize for suggesting I required institutionalization. Cousin Lauren never texted to retract her patronizing prayers. When people realize they have enthusiastically supported a criminal syndicate, they do not offer apologies to the victim. They retreat into the shadows, hoping their complicity is forgotten. The social pressure they had engineered evaporated upon contact with the printed truth. I observed this cascading ruin from the quiet safety of my San Francisco condominium. I did not experience a triumphant thrill or a desire to gloat over their misery. Gloating requires a lingering emotional attachment to the people who hurt you. I felt only the calm, grounded satisfaction of an accountant closing a balanced ledger. I had not destroyed my family. I had not engineered their foreclosure, forced Jessica to hide debt from her husband, or compelled my mother to purchase a fake identification card. They had constructed a towering, precarious house of cards over decades of entitlement and greed. My only action was refusing to provide my own bones to reinforce their failing foundation. By withholding my signature and presenting Evelyn's hidden truth, I merely removed the shield that had protected them from the natural consequences of their own choices. Gravity did the rest. The unyielding reality of the legal system dragged them down to the earth, proving that while lies can assemble a convincing audience, only facts survive the audit. The transition from survival to stability does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical process of clearing the wreckage and sweeping the foundation clean before you can begin laying new bricks. For the first 2 months following the Notary ambush, the lingering echo of my family resonated through the peripheral edges of my life. The federal investigation occupied their days with depositions and asset seizures, keeping them far away from my physical proximity, but the psychological tether required one final, deliberate cut. That moment arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my quartz kitchen island reviewing a standard compliance audit for a regional clinic when my smartphone vibrated against the counter. The caller identification displayed an unknown number. I let the call route to the automated answering service. 3 minutes later, a notification indicated a new audio message had been deposited. I tapped the screen and pressed play. It was Linda. She had borrowed a phone, likely from a neighbor or a sympathetic acquaintance, to bypass the block I had placed on her personal device. Her voice did not carry the sharp, manufactured authority she had utilized during the family group chat intervention. It was brittle, hollowed out by the relentless friction of the legal system dismantling her fabricated reality. Emma, she sobbed, the audio catching and clipping as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. The bank is foreclosing on the house on Friday. They are taking everything. Your father is facing 30 months in a minimum security facility, and Ryan just served your sister with dissolution papers. I hope you are happy. I hope you can sleep at night knowing you broke this family apart over a piece of paper. You could have stopped this. You ruined us. I listened to the recording in its entirety. The old version of myself, the daughter conditioned to absorb their deficits and carry their emotional baggage, might have felt a phantom twinge of guilt. The old Emma might have wondered if the punishment outweighed the crime. But the compliance auditor sitting in that chair recognized the voicemail for exactly what it was. It was a final, desperate refusal to accept accountability. She was not mourning the loss of a relationship with her daughter. She was mourning the loss of her comfortable lifestyle, and she was utilizing the only weapon she had left. She was trying to export her shame onto my ledger. I did not experience a rising heart rate. I did not feel the sudden suffocating panic that used to accompany her demands. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I tapped the export icon on the screen. I forwarded the audio file directly to my attorney David, instructing him to add it to the harassment log we were maintaining for the federal prosecutor. Then I contacted my cellular provider and implemented a network-level block on the unknown number, ensuring my device would never register another incoming ping from that source. It was a small, quiet action. The final pebble of my old life being tossed into the ocean. The surface rippled once, and then the water settled into perfect stillness. With the psychological perimeter secured, I shifted my focus toward the legal architecture of my future. Defending yourself against an active threat is necessary, but building an impenetrable fortress ensures you never have to fight that battle again. I scheduled an extended meeting with David to execute a comprehensive severance of any remaining bureaucratic ties to the Johnson estate. We drafted and filed quitclaim deeds for dormant childhood savings accounts my parents had kept open to artificially inflate their credit utilization ratios. I formally renounced any future claim to their estate, ensuring that when their remaining assets were liquidated by the bankruptcy courts, my name would not appear on a single creditor filing. More importantly, I restructured my own advanced healthcare directives and power of attorney documents. I legally mandated that in the event of my incapacitation, medical or financial decisions would be managed exclusively by a designated corporate fiduciary. I erected an ironclad legal barrier guaranteeing that Thomas, Linda, and Jessica could never again stand in front of a bank manager or a doctor and claim authority over my life. The defensive phase was officially concluded. It was time to build. I transitioned away from the sterile fluorescent-lit banking branches associated with the initial fraud and scheduled an appointment with a boutique wealth management firm located in the financial district. The office featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the deep blue expanse of the San Francisco Bay, a space characterized by natural sunlight and quiet, respectful professionalism. I sat across from a senior fiduciary advisor, sliding the certified trust transfer documents across a glass table. We were not discussing defensive holds or fraud alerts. We were discussing yield curves, diversified index funds, and generational growth. The $3,200,000 was no longer a target painted on my back. It was a foundation. During that meeting, I initiated the paperwork to allocate a specific portion of the capital toward a project that had been quietly taking shape in my mind since the day I opened Evelyn's hidden envelope. I instructed the advisor to carve out $500,000 and place it into a donor-advised charitable fund. I named it the Evelyn Margaret Johnson Grant Initiative. My grandmother understood that financial abuse is the most silent, insidious form of domestic control. It rarely leaves physical bruises. It leaves forged signatures, ruined credit scores, and victims trapped in dangerous environments because they lack the liquid capital to pay a security deposit on a safe apartment or retain a competent lawyer. Evelyn had possessed the resources to protect me, but thousands of young women navigate those exact scenarios without a wealthy matriarch fighting in their corner. The grant program was structured to provide immediate targeted microgrants to women escaping financial coercion. The funds were designed to cover broken lease penalties, emergency relocation expenses, prepaid cellular phones, and initial legal retainers. By weaponizing the very money my family tried to steal, I transformed the instrument of my trauma into a mechanism for someone else's salvation. The capital my father believed would fund a superficial wellness boutique in Los Angeles was now permanently allocated to dismantle the exact type of predatory control he had attempted to exercise. It was the most profound, enduring way to honor the woman who handed me the brass key. The implementation of the grant program initiated a distinct shift in the pacing of my daily life. The chronic vibrating tension that had defined my existence for 3 months slowly evaporated, replaced by a smooth, reflective calm. Security is not merely a number printed on a banking statement. Security is a physical sensation. It is the absence of dread. I realized the magnitude of this shift on a random Sunday morning. I was walking through the produce section of my local grocery store, pushing a metal cart past rows of bright stacked citrus fruits. The store hummed with the mundane, comforting sounds of everyday life. Shoppers discussing recipes. The gentle beep of the checkout registers, the smell of fresh roasted coffee drifting from the corner kiosk. In the past, running errands on a weekend meant navigating a minefield of potential interruptions. My phone would constantly buzz with Jessica demanding an emergency loan to cover a vendor invoice, or Linda sending passive-aggressive text messages about my failure to attend a mandatory family dinner. I used to walk down these same aisles with my shoulders hunched, my nervous system operating in a state of perpetual vigilance, waiting for the next unreasonable demand to shatter my afternoon. I stopped near a display of organic apples. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was completely blank. There were no missed calls. There were no fabricated emergencies requiring my immediate financial intervention. There were no group chats orchestrating my downfall. The device was simply a tool rather than a tracking collar. I took a deep, unobstructed breath. The air smelled of oranges and cold rain. The chronic anxiety that had lived at the base of my neck for 32 years was gone. The aesthetic of my reality had shifted entirely away from tense boardrooms, hostile interrogations, and defensive maneuvering. I was standing in the quiet, sunlit reality of my own independent life. I placed an apple into my cart, enjoying the simple, unburdened weight of the action. I had drawn a boundary with permanent ink, and the peace residing on this side of the line was worth every single battle it took to secure it. Exactly 365 days have passed since the heavy magnetic lock engaged on the door of Beatrice Shaw's notary office. A year is a fascinating unit of measurement. It is long enough for the Earth to complete a full rotation around the Sun, yet brief enough for a manufactured reality to completely dissolve into dust. Today, the sterile fluorescent lighting of corporate banking centers and the claustrophobic tension of windowless conference rooms feel like relics from a previous lifetime. I am standing on the sprawling cedar deck of a coastal house I purchased in Carmel by the sea. The architecture is modest but structurally flawless, featuring wide glass panes that frame the rugged California coastline. The morning air carries the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles mixed with the heavy brine of the Pacific Ocean. A brisk coastal wind sweeps up from the jagged rocks below, pulling the lingering marine layer back out to sea. I hold a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee between my hands, letting the ceramic warmth radiate into my palms. The rhythmic, percussive sound of the surf crashing against the shoreline provides a steady, grounding acoustic backdrop to my morning routine. This property sits exactly 3 streets away from the garden where my grandmother Evelyn used to spend her afternoons. I bought it outright, utilizing a clean, verified wire transfer that required no shadow guarantors, no fabricated identification cards, and no frantic explanations. The transaction was a seamless exchange of legitimate capital, a quiet testament to the security that arrives when your financial foundation is anchored in truth rather than deception. While I watch the ocean tide recede, I occasionally reflect on the current trajectory of the people who attempted to sink this foundation. The American legal system does not operate on sentiment, and it does not offer discounts for familial relation. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable documentary evidence, my father Thomas accepted a plea agreement to avoid a prolonged, highly publicized trial. He is currently serving a 24-month sentence in a federal minimum security camp in Nevada. The man who once demanded my social security number wearing a tailored charcoal suit now wears standard-issue khaki uniforms, his daily schedule dictated entirely by the warden. My mother, Linda, was spared federal incarceration through a cooperation agreement, but she could not escape the economic devastation of their choices. Stripped of the marital home and the illusion of generational wealth, she currently rents a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a suburban strip mall complex. She works as a cashier at a discount retail chain, spending her days scanning barcodes under the same harsh fluorescent lights she used to believe she was too refined to endure. Jessica experienced the most precipitous fall from grace. Stripped of her fraudulent wellness empire and abandoned by a husband who refused to absorb her hidden debts, she filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy in Los Angeles. The curated social media influencer who demanded my inheritance to fund a luxury flagship store now works as an hourly shift supervisor at a corporate coffee franchise. She spends her afternoons wearing a polyester apron, handing out paper cups to the exact demographic she used to target with overpriced crystal serums. The mathematics of their lives finally balance, zeroing out the decades of unearned entitlement. I do not monitor their struggles with any sense of vindictive joy. Vengeance requires an active expenditure of emotional energy, and I refuse to spend another ounce of my bandwidth on their ledger. I simply acknowledge their reality, the same way I acknowledge the weather. It is a fact occurring outside my window, unable to penetrate the walls of my home. Instead of looking backward, I focus my energy on the structural integrity of the future. The Evelyn Margaret Johnson Grant Initiative, the charitable foundation I established with the remaining capital, issued its first official disbursement 6 months ago. The recipient was a 28-year-old woman trapped in a severely coercive marriage, facing a husband who tightly controlled every bank account and credit line to prevent her escape. She needed a security deposit for a safe apartment and a retainer for a competent divorce attorney. Because of the trust fund my family tried to steal, I was able to sign a grant authorization that transferred the exact amount she needed directly into a secure escrow account. The money bypassed her abuser entirely. I remember the profound, settling warmth that filled my chest the moment my pen left the signature line. The wealth that Thomas intended to squander on a vain, failing retail venture had been transformed into a surgical tool, cutting a vulnerable woman free from her own financial prison. The capital did exactly what Evelyn designed it to do. It protected the target. I turn away from the cedar railing and step back inside the house, sliding the heavy glass patio door shut against the ocean breeze. The interior of the living room is bathed in natural sunlight, highlighting the exposed wooden beams and the large stone hearth anchoring the space. The environment feels organic, breathing, and entirely authentic. Resting on the center of the stone mantel, positioned perfectly at eye level, sits a custom shadow box frame. It does not contain a photograph or a piece of expensive art. Resting inside the protective museum-grade glass is the thick parchment envelope I retrieved from the Carmel depository. The paper is slightly worn at the edges, bearing the faint indentations of the steel letter opener Beatrice Shaw used to break it open. The dark red wax seal sits in two fractured pieces, the ornate initial forever split down the middle. I walk over to the hearth and look at the broken wax. It is the most valuable object I own. It is a physical embodiment of the foresight, love, and ruthless pragmatism my grandmother utilized to save my life. It is the ultimate proof that you do not need to scream to be heard, and you do not need to match the aggression of your abusers to secure your freedom. We are often conditioned to believe that family is an unbreakable contract, a biological obligation requiring us to absorb endless amounts of toxicity in the name of loyalty. We are taught to manage the chaos to keep the peace, and to constantly negotiate with people who view our boundaries as insults. But looking at the framed envelope on my mantel, I understand the fundamental flaw in that conditioning. Strength isn't about carrying everyone's lies. It's about knowing when to put the pen down and let the paper speak. You do not have to participate in the smear campaigns. You do not have to attend the staged interventions or defend your sanity against a jury of people committed to misunderstanding you. You simply have to gather the ledgers, secure the metadata, and wait for the appropriate venue to present the undeniable truth. The truth does not require an emotional performance. It only requires a witness. My name is Emma Johnson. I am a medical compliance auditor. I live in a quiet house by the ocean, surrounded by a peace I earned through cold, unyielding facts. I am no longer a dormant asset waiting to be liquidated, and nobody will ever forge my signature again. That is my story, and if you have stayed with me until the very end, I want to thank you for listening. Now, I want to turn the floor over to you. Option 1. Have you ever had to use cold, hard facts to stop a toxic family member in their tracks? Option 2. Have you ever discovered a secret a loved one left behind to protect you from beyond the grave? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want to hear more stories about ordinary people dismantling impossible situations, hit the subscribe button and join our community. Until next time, remember to guard your signature, trust the raw data, and never let anyone else write your final chapter.